All right, in this short video, we're going to talk about historical materialism more in depth, more specifically. If you remember back to the beginning of the semester, we talked about Marx's version of how history evolves, that being historical materialism. Emphasis placed on the material world and how that impacts and generates changes in our ideas, with the focus being the material world. Marx says, not only is this a new way to interpret the past, but now this is also a way that we can attempt to predict the future. And so in this video, we're going to go over his ideas for how that happens. This is sort of known as the Marxist concept of history, or of the evolution of history, and we're talking specifically for this video in an economic context, which is basically what Marx's focus was anyways. He really had an economic approach to humanity and history. So he says that humanity really started out in a primitive version of communism. If you think back to the hunter and gatherer societies that we discussed at depth, Marx says this was basic communism. No real competition between the people. It was really just focused on survival, and all resources were shared equally among the people to try to promote the survival of the tribes overall. He says the next material economic transition was to slave society. Now, when society started to advance, started to focus less on day-to-day survival, started to conquer other tribes and things like that, exploitation began at this phase in human history when people would use others as their slaves. From there, we transition into feudalism, which we've discussed at length. This is the royalty, clergy, nobility, serfs, right? This type of system of stratification. So this is now even more full-blown exploitation of the serfs and really, really complex system of stratification, ways to produce goods and services. From there, we transition into, and we've talked about this a little bit already, capitalism, which we know full and well, and we'll get to much more in depth later in this unit. We transition from a feudalist system into a capitalistic system, and here the merchants of the feudalistic society transition to being the capitalists and the elite within the capitalistic society. We've done this at depth already. From capitalism, and this is sort of Marx predicting the future here, right? This is when he's writing around the time of the Industrial Revolution, fully capitalistic society. He says, now I can also anticipate what's going to happen in the future using this sort of historical materialist concept. He says that capitalism inherently has characteristics that will lead to its downfall, and we'll get to this into some future videos. But he says capitalism will fail. It is basically designed to fail. Its very fundamental way that it exists is flawed and will eventually lead to its downfall. He says what's next is socialism. We'll get into depth into what socialism is, but this is basically a hybrid of capitalism and pure communism as Marx lays out. Socialism for Marx is essentially sort of a transition phase between capitalism and communism, and he argues that it's necessary in order to go from capitalism to communism to travel through the socialistic economic system first. We'll get to that in a little bit. Finally, after we've gone through this transition period for Marx, we get into communism. And I have here pure communism, and we'll talk about what that is a little bit later. So we go from capitalism to socialism, and then finally into communism. So this is Marxism. This is Marx's theory for how we're going to transition as humanity throughout these economic systems: primitive communism, slave society, feudalism, capitalism, and once that falls in the future, we will get to socialism as a transition period, and then finally on into pure communism. One of the largest critiques of Marx is that he anticipated this entire process going from capitalism to communism taking place within his lifetime. He thought that society was on the verge of this happening really, really quickly. Clearly that has not happened throughout the world. So that's one of the biggest critiques. You might argue that that is still to come, and perhaps a time frame that Marx was viewing was just slightly or incredibly longer than he thought that was what was going to happen. But this is sort of his idea for how economic systems transition.